Mr. President, it's a tragedy that in your home state of Louisiana, my state of Ohio, and around this country, that girls and women, children and adults are being trafficked online. Sex trafficking is really a stain on our country. We've taken some actions here in the United States Senate to deal with this. We've passed 4 or 5 bills to increase prosecution of those who engage in this, to ensure that women who are victims are treated as such and not as criminals. We've talked about how to help find missing children. I've been involved in those efforts. We have a caucus here on trafficking that's gotten involved in these issues. But here's the reality as I see it. Unbelievably, in the 21st century, this practice of selling people is increasing, and it's increasing primarily because it's moved online, where it is tragically efficient. And we have learned through an extensive investigation over the last couple of years that there is one website online that handles most of the commercial sex business and most of the trafficking, and that's a website called Backpage.com. And so what we have done here in the United States Senate by focusing on this issue is tried to determine how do you turn the tide, begin to get to the point where instead of hearing more and more stories about women and girls and sometimes boys being trafficked online, that in fact we are beginning to get to a situation where we can find ways to get those people into treatment and recovery, deal with their trauma, and begin to stop this horrendous practice. Really taking away the God-given potential of those engaged in it. Nothing more horrible than meeting a young girl who's been trafficked and hearing the horrendous stories. I recently was back in Ohio and had the opportunity to visit with some victims, and I remember one young woman in particular told me she was trafficked at age 9, starting at age 9, by her father. And he would take her to the Super Bowls out of town, and he would traffic her online in their hometown. And imagine the trauma and the heartbreak. Typically, now it's connected also with heroin or fentanyl or prescription drugs or other opioids. In other words, these girls or women are often made dependent in part from their addiction, and the traffickers cruelly use that addiction to force them to do things they would never otherwise envision. So we know that. We know that this is happening. We know it's increasing. We know that it's online. What do we do about it? Well, unfortunately, as we have learned in our investigation, these websites online that engage in this are largely protected. They're immune from prosecution. They're immune from victims being able to get justice because they are denied justice because of a federal law that protects these evil people who knowingly are engaged directly in sex trafficking. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? But that's what's happening. Victims were denied justice just 2 weeks ago when a judge in Sacramento, California dismissed pimping charges against Backpage.com, this group I talked about, because of what they cited, which is a broad immunity granted by a 1996 law called the Communications Decency Act. As the court saw it, and other courts have seen it, this law gives third-party website providers or publishers immunity from these kinds of heinous crimes, even if the website is participating in sex trafficking. The court opinion made it clear it's up to Congress to remedy this injustice, suggesting, and I quote, "If and until Congress sees fit to amend the immunity law, the broad reach of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act even applies to those who allege to support the exploitation of others by human trafficking," end quote. In other words, what the courts have said is, Congress, this is up to you. You passed legislation, I believe inadvertently, that provides this immunity and protection for these people who continue to engage, knowingly participate in trafficking, including of underage girls. But this is just the most recent ruling in a string of judicial decisions that have defended Backpage and the other sites from legal challenges, despite their involvement in this criminal activity. In 2016, last year, the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Backpage in a case brought by 3 girls who were sold for sex on the site. But the court opinion noted that in order to fix the problem, quote, the remedy is through legislation, not litigation. They called the practice what it is, immoral, but then they said the solution is not more litigation, it's legislation. In other words, Congress, get your act together. Get your act together. These court rulings underscore the need for us to get our act together and to do so with urgency, because every day that goes by, more girls, more women are trafficked online. And this must stop. Having met with dozens of sex trafficking victims, I asked them the question, of course, how did it get to this point? Were you trafficked by someone? How did you find yourself here? And most of these victims tell me the same story, which is Backpage.com, which is their trafficker has them, as they say, off the street corner onto the smartphone. And again, tragically efficient in the sense they may be sold 10, 15, in one case, 20 times during a single evening. They deserve to know that we will not passively let this injustice continue. They deserve to know that Congress will step up and correct this federal legislation that we passed here in Congress 20-some years ago to deal with this issue. On August 1st, in August, I visited the Oasis House in Dayton, Ohio. Oasis is a wonderful place. They welcome up to 11 women at a time to live in a faith-based community that provides them incredible support, helps deal with the trauma we talked about earlier, helps them to be moving from that trauma to independence. They are getting recovery and support there. And so many of these women have had a transformation, and it's wonderful to see them back with their families or back at work. In speaking with these victims, Backpage came up, as it often does. And it's just heartbreaking to hear what they had to say, but mostly that they can't get justice, that the website that facilitated these crimes against them is off limits. That's why in July, after an 18-month investigation into online trafficking, I introduced, along with a number of my colleagues, legislation called Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. Currently, we have 27 co-sponsors here in the Senate. We've only had this introduced while we've been in session for 2 weeks, because we introduced it just before the August recess. But Senator Richard Blumenthal, Senator John McCain, Senator Claire McCaskill, Senator John Cornyn, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and more than 20 other senators have joined in this effort to deal with the real problem we see, which is the growth of trafficking due to the online presence, and specifically some of these websites like Backpage. The bill would make 3 narrowly crafted changes to what's called the Communications Decency Act to allow Backpage and other websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking be brought to justice. First, it allows victims of sex trafficking to seek justice against websites. It does so by removing the law's unintended protection we talked about for online sex traffickers. Second, it helps law enforcement by allowing the prosecution of websites, again, that knowingly assist, support, or facilitate a violation of already existing federal sex trafficking laws. There's already a law in place that makes it illegal to engage in sex trafficking. The exception is, again, these websites online that are protected by the Communications Decency Act. So it basically just says you will be treated like others if you engage in this, facilitate it, support it. Finally, it lets state law enforcement, not just the Department of Justice, take legal action against these websites that violate federal sex trafficking laws. The Communications Decency Act, again, was enacted by Congress a couple of decades ago, 21 years ago. And now it needs to be brought into the 21st century. Again, it's an important piece of legislation, broadly speaking, But on this particular issue, inadvertently, I believe, it has allowed this incredible injustice to continue. In my view, victims shouldn't have to wait one more day to get the justice they deserve. And state and local prosecutors, those on the front lines, should be able to prosecute Backpage and others for their roles in these crimes. The leading website for online sex trafficking has and will continue to escape legal justice for its active role in trafficking unless Congress acts. The solution's right in front of us. This bipartisan legislation will make the changes necessary. By the way, these are changes that a number of groups on the outside have called for and have strongly supported. On August 15th, I was proud to announce the support of 16 new Ohio organizations and officials who endorsed the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act. This list includes anti-human trafficking advocates, human rights groups, state officials, Ohio sex trafficking victims, among others. This is in addition to the list of dozens of national anti-human trafficking and law enforcement groups who've come out publicly in support of this bill. I appreciate them. I appreciate what the human trafficking advocacy groups do every day, try to help these victims. I really appreciate our law enforcement officials. And the fact that organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police have stepped forward to support this legislation is very important. On August 16th, the day after we had this endorsement from all these groups from Ohio, 50 attorneys general from across the United States, 50, including Ohio's Mike DeWine, our Attorney General, sent a letter to Congress asking for the Communications Decency Act to be changed to allow state and local authorities to hold Backpage and other websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking accountable. The letter stated in part, it is both ironic and tragic that CDA, the Communications Decency Act, which was intended to protect children from indecent material on the internet, is now used as a shield by those who profit from prostitution and crimes against children. They're right. Initially, the Communications Decency Act was actually put in place to try to shield young people from pornography. So what these attorneys general are calling for and what the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act will do is to allow us to go after these websites. This bill will allow victims to get justice, as I said, and will do so in a way that protects internet companies that are doing the right thing. Notably, we preserve the Communications Decency Act's Good Samaritan provision, which protects those good actors who proactively block and screen for offensive material, shielding them from any possibility of frivolous lawsuits. That's important. The good actors out there, and the vast majority of websites are good actors, have nothing to do with sex trafficking. In fact, many of them police their site for it. So the Facebooks of the world and the Googles of the world, they're not the bad actors. We are gaining momentum within the tech community, some of whom have concerns about changing the Communications Decency Act. Just this week, we got a letter from Oracle strongly supporting the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. They agreed that this narrowly crafted bill will hold the bad actors accountable while protecting well-intentioned websites. Oracle's letter says, in part, your legislation does not, as suggested by the bill's opponents, usher in the end of the internet. If enacted, it will actually establish some measure of accountability for those that cynically self-advertise but are unprepared to help curtail sex trafficking, end quote. Other tech companies have also joined in the fight to ensure that we can stop sex trafficking. And I know they're going to follow Oracle's lead in publicly supporting this legislation. Courts across the country, again, have made it clear that their hands are tied. Their hands are tied in bringing Backpage and other websites to justice. It is our responsibility, right here in the United States Senate, in the United States Congress, to change this law. Women and children have had their most basic rights stripped from them and have been let down by our judicial system. And frankly, up to now by Congress in their search for justice. With these latest calls to action from judicial rulings and this recent letter from 50 attorneys general, any future injustice in the legal system because of the Communications Decency Act falls on Congress. It falls on the shoulders of those here in the United States Senate and the House. It's not just the attorneys general around the country who have supported this. The district attorneys have sent a letter this week supporting it. Again, other law enforcement across the board. And through this legislation, we have the opportunity to right this wrong, to make a real difference, therefore, in the lives of vulnerable women and children who've been victims of trafficking. Justice cannot be seen, but its absence can be felt. And those who have been trafficked by Backpage, only to see the company prosper and escape legal consequences, have experienced unimaginable injustice. They feel it. The path to action is clear. Victims need this legislation that courts, attorneys general, district attorneys, victims, and others have called for. Congress must pass Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act in order to correct this injustice. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.